Officials from the United Nations gathered at the U.S. State Department recently to discuss the process for developing rules, guidelines, and sustainable goals among countries for the long-term peaceful use of outer space activities. In June of 2016, a UN committee issued the first set of agreed-upon guidelines. A full compendium will be sent to the General Assembly in 2018. This 90-minute forum was hosted by the Secure World Foundation.
Good morning. Welcome to the State Department. My name is Jonathan Margolis. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Oceans, International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. My specific portfolio is science, space, and health issues. In the OES Bureau, that's Oceans, Environment, and Science, we advance U.S. foreign policy goals in critical areas of environment, oceans, health, and science. We work on climate change, including the Paris Agreement and the recently negotiated HFC agreement in Kigali under the Montreal Protocol. We work on oceans and fisheries issues, including the recent major Our Ocean Conference conducted here in the State Department under the leadership of Secretary Kerry. We work on health issues, on Zika outbreak, on Ebola, and on global health security, which seeks to enhance global preparedness and response to the threats of infectious disease. And of course, today, we're here to talk about space sustainability. For many of you in the audience, this will be your first introduction to the issue of sustaining the outer space environment. And for others today, it will be an opportunity to learn more about the ongoing efforts by the United States, by other countries, and by the United Nations to preserve the outer space environment. By the end of today, we hope that one thing will be clear. With the increased use of and reliance on space, preserving the outer space environment for current and future generations is in everyone's best interest. And that's true whether you're here representing a government, a business, an NGO, or just yourself. One of the places we work on these issues is through the UN's Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UN COPUOS. And we're thankful today that Mr. Peter Martinez, who chairs the committee's working group on long-term sustainability, has traveled from Cape Town, South Africa, to share further insights with us on this important work. And likewise, we're grateful that we have here today as well Ms. Simonetta de Peppo, the Director for the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, and Mr. David Kendall from Canada, the Chair of the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Thank you all for coming. In June of this past year, the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space agreed to 12 long-term sustainability guidelines. We call them the LTS guidelines. And they represent the first ever agreed best practices for safe and responsible use of space. This is work that started under the United Nations in 2009, and this is a major milestone going forward after 7 years of concerted effort. The United States believes that this agreement is a significant accomplishment and a major step forward in international cooperation on preserving outer space environment. The guidelines set global norms that will maintain the space environment so that future generations can benefit from transformative technologies for climate modeling, navigation, communications, and health, as well as strength and security. Additionally, with the increase of private investment in space, it has become even more important to provide a stable, predictable, long-term framework for space operations. These guidelines incorporate a range of best practices, including sharing of information for enhanced spaceflight safety, expanded cooperation in space weather monitoring, and investigating new measures to manage long-term space debris. We appreciate the constructive efforts within the committee to ensure this first set of LTS guidelines were completed prior to the expiration of the working group's work plan in June of 2016. We also look forward to continuing the work within COPUOS to develop additional LTS guidelines over the next 2 years. On the national level, many countries have started looking at how they can best implement these first sets of guidelines. And we believe that this action taken by nation states, by member states, is an important benefit of the LTS guidelines. I can provide a first-hand report on how this is going. Just yesterday, we held our second ever bilateral civil space dialogue with China and discussed these very issues, and some of our colleagues from that discussion are here today with us. We'll hear more from government from governmental officials, from private sector space experts, on how these LTS guidelines were developed and their importance moving forward. One of the main themes you will hear today is the importance of international cooperation in ensuring the outer space environment. When COPUOS set out to develop the LTS guidelines, COPUOS member states acknowledged the importance of a global approach to tackling the challenge of preserving the outer space environment. And today we've assembled an outstanding group of people to speak to you about this. In our first panel, United Nations experts will discuss the process by which the first set of LTS guidelines were developed and next steps in developing additional guidelines. In our second panel this morning, we will hear from government experts from a cross-sector of regional groups on their efforts to implement the first set of guidelines and their commitment to developing additional guidelines through COPUOS. The third panel will consist of private sector stakeholders. We look forward to hearing more about their experience in contributing to the development of the first set of guidelines and how they intend to advance and engage with COPUOS as we move forward. And finally today, we will hear from a number of individuals regarding next steps in developing a second set of guidelines with the goal of creating a compendium of LTS guidelines to be endorsed by the General Assembly, by the UN General Assembly in 2018. So, on behalf of the State Department, let me use this opportunity to thank you all for joining us here today and for thanking them for coming to speak to us. Your presence is essential in conveying the understanding and the importance of space sustainability for the benefit of all mankind and the reasons why we should work together to address this challenge. Before I close, let me personally thank Michael Simpson and Victoria Sampson, both of the Secure World Foundation. What you're seeing today is the work of not only the State Department, but NGOs and others that have brought this discussion format in an open forum. And we absolutely rely on organizations like the Secure World Foundation to make this possible. So with that in mind, let me welcome to the floor, to the podium here, Michael Simpson, the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation. Thank you.
Well, for those many of you whose faces are very familiar from several acts of cooperation and consultation and collaboration in the field of space sustainability, Secure World Foundation probably doesn't need much introduction. For the rest, simply be aware that we have for years described our work as seeking cooperative solutions for space sustainability. And so here we are celebrating space sustainability, advocating increased cooperation, and enjoying the presence of so many people with whom we have cooperated along the way to make this day possible. In some ways, I'm welcoming you to a celebration. 6 hard years of work has brought us 12 guidelines to support the long-term sustainability of space activities. Guidelines, remember, that have been adopted among countries who have not always found consensus easy to achieve. From practical affirmations of how to best fulfill obligations under the space treaties, to foundational guidance on the sharing of critical data about satellites, debris, and weather, we have coaxed progress out of what looked at times like barren soil. To add to the celebration, we are hearing encouraging reports from the intercessional work that the COPUOS Working Group on Long-Term Sustainability of Space Activities has been undertaking since its success last June. These reports fuel hopes that further consensus will bring more agreed guidelines to the table next year. But of course, I also welcome you to an event that includes lunch. And as those of us who were thrust by great writers like Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein into careers in the space sector know all too well, there is no such thing as a free lunch. In fact, today's program will attest there is much work to be done. Whether you see the guidelines as soft law or no law at all, they will still have to stand the same test as hard law or sound policy. They will need to impact behavior. As we review the track that brought us here and chart the course to come, I hope we can bear in mind that the way forward will pass through the seminal work of Unispace Plus 50 and will carry the weight and aspiration of other broad agreements like the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Accord, and COP21. So as we get back to the hard work so many of us in this room are used to sharing together, I still invite you to think of that work as a celebration, knowing that having kept alive the principle of using space for peaceful purposes, we now get to show how together we can focus those purposes on meeting the greatest challenges of the one planet we all share. So to paraphrase our late departed Mr. Spock, celebrate, work hard, and prosper. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Sampson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation, and I'd like to add my thanks and appreciation for everyone in the audience for coming and to our speakers for sharing their expertise with us. So with that, enough of the welcomes. Let's get the speakers up on the podium and have you guys come up. Could the first panelist come up, please? You should have everyone's bios in front of you, and so with that, we'll start with our first speaker, Simonetta De Pipo.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, distinguished participants, guests, and colleagues. I'm very pleased to be here with you today. Let me thank the organizers for arranging this timely event on the important topics of space sustainability. I would like also to take this opportunity to acknowledge a recent success story about the long-term sustainability of other space activities. As has already been stated, and as my colleague will elaborate in more detail, in June 2016, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space reached a multilateral milestone when it agreed to a first set of guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. This concrete output demonstrates a collective recognition by states that space is a key resource for the benefit of humankind, and the measures that could enhance sustainability and protect the space environment for current and future generations are in the common interest. The first set of guidelines was not, however, developed without genuine effort on the part of many stakeholders. In this regard, I would like to express my admiration for all delegations who participated in the process so far, and I would especially like to acknowledge the chair of the working group, Peter Martinez, for his outstanding role in bringing delegations together in this complex process, and the chair of COPUS, David Kendall, for his skillful handling of the adoption procedures at the COPUS session in June. Continued collaboration between all interest parties will be of key importance as the Working Group on the Long-Term Sustainability of Outer Space Activities develops a second set of guidelines and finally a full compendium of guidelines, including the preambular text, to be referred to the General Assembly in 2018. Dear colleagues, let me now address some aspects of the interconnection between the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and the strategic work to be undertaken under the 50th anniversary of the first Unispace conference, Unispace Plus 50, to take place in June 2018. COPUS this year endorsed a set of 7 thematic priorities which together constitute the common road towards Unispace Plus 50 and beyond. The thematic priorities, as defined and endorsed by COPUS in June, are number 1, global partnership in space exploration and innovation. Number 2, legal regime of outer space and global space governance, current and future perspectives. Number 3, enhanced information exchange on space objects and events. Number 4, international framework for space weather services. Number 5, strengthen space cooperation for global health. Number 6, international cooperation towards low emissions and resilient societies. And number 7, capacity building for the 21st century. Those priorities have been selected based on an assessment of the cross-cutting areas of governance, resiliency, interoperability, capacity building, and sustainable development. They are strategically interlinked and are designed to provide a focused and result-oriented approach for the upcoming work of Member States and the Office for Outer Space Affairs. Included in this is the fostering of dialogue between governments and NGOs, industry, private sector, and civil society. The thematic priorities are intended to help us identify the areas where stronger space governance and supporting structures are required to protect the space environment and secure the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. They also help us ensure that the benefits of space support missions in implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and reaching these goals. The interlinkages between them reflect the need for stronger coordination, mechanisms on governance, interoperability, and resiliency. As an example, space exploration and innovation, covered by thematic priority number 1, is an essential driver for opening up new domains in space science and technology, triggering new partnerships and developing capabilities that create new opportunities for addressing global challenges. There is a strong aim to foster dialogue with space industry and the private sector in this regard. Dear colleagues, you will likely have noticed the close connections between the guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and the Unispace Plus 50 thematic priorities. The guideline on the safety of space operations, to highlight an example, are fundamentally linked to the thematic priorities on enhanced information exchange on space objects and on an international framework for space weather services. The fact that guidelines on sharing orbital information on space objects, debris monitoring, and space weather forecasts have already been reached consensus, demonstrates a clear acknowledgement by the international community of the importance of enhancing information exchange on space objects and events and on building up an international framework for space weather services. Regarding long-term work on the sustainability of outer space activities, the thematic priority on the legal regime of outer space and global space governance, current and future perspective, that's the title of the thematic priority number 2, in combination with the thematic priority on enhanced information exchange on space objects and events, number 3, is particularly interesting. Allow me, therefore, to make an assessment of certain critical interlinkages. Thematic priority number 2 on the legal regime strives to promote the universality of the 5 United Nations treaties on outer space and assess the state of affairs of those treaties and their relationship with related non-legally binding instruments. The thematic priority aims to analyze the effectiveness of the legal regime of outer space and to identify areas that may require additional consideration. there is a close connection between the work undertaken by relevant working groups of both the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee of COPUOS. Efficiency, coordination, and the avoidance of duplication of work are central pillars in this structure. The goal of thematic priority number 3 on enhanced information exchange on space objects and events is to define and develop requirements for enhanced information exchange and notification procedures, particularly on risk reduction efforts for the safety of space operations. Cooperation mechanisms to support this objective should be identified, and capacity building and outreach activities on transparency and confidence building measures encouraged. In this context, let me reiterate the importance of building a robust and cost-efficient information system that in the end must serve all relevant actors. I wish to recall for your information a special report by the United Nations Interagency Coordination Mechanism, better known as UN Space, which is a long-standing formal coordination mechanism in the UN system under the leadership of the Office for Outer Space Affairs. This report was prepared by UNUSA in close coordination with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs and issued for COPUOS this June. And you can find it as document A/AC.105/1116. The report addresses, among other matters, the current information exchange mechanisms and notification procedures under the legal regime of outer space, for which UNUSA discharges the responsibilities of the Secretary General. Among those are the Register on Space Objects and operational mechanisms instituted under the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, and the Nuclear Power Source Principles. The United Nations Register is the most important global treaty-based transparency and confidence-building mechanism in the space arena. Given that UNUSA has the formal authority to discharge the responsibilities of the United Nations SG under the legal regime of outer space, there is increasing attention paid by COPUOS to study ways and means of gaining efficiency and avoiding duplication in fundamental registration and notification procedure at governmental level. Any efforts to support robust transparency and confidence-building measures call for realistic, legally based and policy-motivated requirements. The operational needs and requirements must not be underestimated, and this is why there is a call by COPUOS to study those existing long-standing mechanisms as a basis and fundament for enhanced risk reduction communication. I would like to recall the importance of the extensive review done by the legal subcommittee of COPUOS nearly 10 years ago on enhancing registration practice. As you are aware, this work resulted in the successful General Assembly 2007 resolution number 62/101. The resolution gives room for additional registration reporting on, for example, the change in status of space objects. It may be appropriate to look into the application and scope of this resolution, informing additional guidance for voluntary information exchange and risk reduction notification. Dear colleagues, let me turn to another but closely related area of sustainability that is also covered by a dedicated Unispace Plus 50 thematic priority, namely on international framework for space weather services. It is becoming increasingly evident that there is a need to strengthen the reliability of space systems and their ability to respond to the impact of adverse space weather and to develop a space weather roadmap for international coordination and information exchange on space weather events and their mitigation. Space weather is recognized as a global challenge, and increasing awareness of this issue will help to identify governance and cooperation mechanisms. Globally, there is already a growing interest in better understanding solar-terrestrial interactions, particularly patterns and trends in space weather. This is not only for scientific reasons. Reliable operation of ground and space-based assets and critical infrastructures are increasingly dependent on their ability to withstand the detrimental effects of space weather. Therefore, the global community needs to be prepared. UNOS has been involved in activities and projects on space weather for many years, especially through dedicated scientific and technical activities with states and national space agencies, including long-standing collaboration with NASA, and through capacity-building programs on space weather. We are also working closely with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, in addressing, through a series of aerospace symposiums, areas of concern to the aviation and space communities, including on space weather. COPUS is presently focusing attention on space weather also through a dedicated expert group on space weather under its scientific and technical subcommittee. This work is closely connected to Unispace Plus 50 and, as said, with thematic priority number 4. Dear colleagues, in conclusion, I trust I've been able to show that while we, as an international community, have achieved already something significant in this area, a lot remains to be done to enhance the sustainability of outer space activities. UNOSA is ready to do everything it can to collaborate with all stakeholders to achieve the objectives set out by COPUS for Unispace Plus 50 and beyond. In the period leading towards 2018, UNOSA will use various occasions to raise awareness of Unispace Plus 50 in particular, as well as to present the work of the Office and the Committee and our efforts to foster peaceful cooperation in outer space. The Office will be organizing a series of 3 high-level fora, space as a driver for socio-economic sustainable development. The first high-level forum is being organized by the Office for Outer Space Affairs in collaboration with the government of the United Arab Emirates. The forum will be convened from the 20th to the 24th of November 2016 in Dubai. The high-level forum in November this year will facilitate a constructive dialogue between policymakers and key stakeholders in the broader space community to address the impact of economic, environmental, social, policy, and regulatory dimensions of space. The forum will produce a declaration with a set of recommendations to further shape and position space activities as drivers for innovations, socioeconomic development, and diplomacy for a sustainable future. The safety, security, and sustainability of other space activities have a fundamental impact on this process. Working with all relevant stakeholders in addressing overarching long-term development concerns, a roadmap towards Space 2030 will give us the tool to define concrete deliverables of Unispace Plus 50 and beyond, based on the 4 pillars of space economy, space society, space accessibility, and space diplomacy. Space 2030 should help us, the space community, to address the importance of space activities to fulfill the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and to be sure that, while space research, technology, and applications are drivers for socio-economic development, no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, move along the table to David Kendall, the current chair of the United Nations Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Dave?
Good, thank you very much. And certainly it's a privilege to be here with you today and to be invited to this event. And I want to commend very much the US State Department and Secure World for bringing us together to discuss this very important topic and to, I actually don't like the word socialize, but I will use it, socialize these long-term sustainability guidelines. As chair, I really hope that this is the first of many such forums that I'm invited to by different countries. As many of you probably know, COPUS has 83 member states. We'll have 84, hopefully, by the end of this year when New Zealand joins us. And this is now very important, this effort that we need to make now to ensure that countries and states understand what we're doing and what the ramifications of these guidelines will be on, I think, all space actors in the future. As noted by Simonetta and others, we've really, I think, reached a very important milestone. It's been a long, hard road, and I want to give credit, actually, to the people who really started this. This started well over 10 years ago. Back with Unispace 3 in 1999, when the genesis of the ideas of security and sustainability of outer space were put forward, brought forward by the chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee in the early 2000s, Karl Deutsch. and then picked up again and really, I think, was very well developed by Gérard Brachet, who we have in the audience here, when he was chair some decade ago, that really started the momentum going, and then supported, of course, by the Office for Outer Space Affairs. Mazlan Othman is here, who led a lot of that, and of course has been picked up now by Simonetta. So there are many fathers and mothers of this process, and it has been a very sustained, I think, and an excellent collaboration. Clearly, a lot of you don't come to these agreements without some, I would say, challenges, and there have been challenges. Those have been, I think, extremely well handled by Peter Martinez on my left, who will talk much more about the details. But I'd just like to really, as chair, mention the collegiality that we found inside the committee on putting this together. Now, we have 83 states. Not all states have been fully engaged, I would say, but all states have signed on, and that's very, very important. But states such as, of course, the US, the Russian Federation, Japan, France, China, India, Germany, Italy, Canada, Brazil, Mexico, I can go on. These are the leaders who have come together week after week to really put these guidelines into the state we have them right now. And let us not underestimate the importance of these guidelines. As mentioned by Simonetta and others, these are really, I believe, going to change the way that we work in space collectively and globally. Now, it's appropriate these come through Copious. It's a unique platform, the only really global platform that we have that can discuss these types of issues. And as Simonetta has mentioned, we are undertaking right now a reevaluation of the agenda of Copious to ensure that issues dealing with the long-term sustainability, dealing with security in space, dealing with the other thematic priorities that Simonetta has mentioned, really we start to address those in a very open way over the next decade, leading, as Simonetta said, through this Unispace Plus 50 exercise, which we will conduct in 2018. Now, one way of looking at the long-term sustainability, and a way I like to look at them, is using the term that others have used, which is TCBMs, transparency and confidence building measures. This term really came out of a group of UN group of governmental experts that met about what we now 4 or 5 years ago. And their report was agreed by the General Assembly and is now being followed. We have to, and I think that the term is very apropos, we really do have to start working on much more transparency, and we are going to need to build confidence amongst the various actors. You know, we hear on a regular basis about the congested nature of space, how it is contested, how it is competitive, and how it is vulnerable. And there is not much, really a week goes by without some issues that need to be dealt with on a fairly high level in order to ensure that we do not make a mistake and we have a really bad day up above us. These TCBMs, though, these transparency and confidence building measures, have to some extent been used over a number of years now to develop a number of forums, not only the long-term sustainability, forums where one can get major states together to discuss coordination of their activities in key areas where we're dealing with space. I'll mention a few of them because it has been, I would say, a relatively successful decade of starting to build this confidence. I mentioned the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, 13 major agencies that get together and at great detail discussed the way that space debris is being tracked, is being handled, is being mitigated. Most of you know about the IADC guidelines, the guidelines that non-binding guidelines that sort of guide space actors as to how to mitigate against more adding to the space debris. We have, well, a very classic one is the International Space Station. That has built confidence amongst the major states in operating together in space. We have two new committees, consultative committees, coordination committees dealing with asteroid threats, the International Asteroid Warning Network and the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, both which came out of the Unispace Plus 50 and COPIUS activities, which are now meeting on a regular basis to look at how to work together as nations to ensure that we can react to a possible asteroid threat. The ICG, the International Coordination Group on Global Navigation Satellite Systems, I think is another very good example of how countries are getting together. All those countries who now have interest in global navigation systems are talking to each other about compatibility, about how they're not going to jam each other's signals, about how they can share relative information. That's a huge breakthrough. Came out of COPIUS and Unispace Plus 50. Great leadership has been shown there to build this confidence in the way that we can work together. It doesn't matter which states we are. So I think that we are on a good track. We need to do more. The long-term sustainability activity is an extremely important one. We have now, as Simonetta has mentioned, achieved a certain level of success. We have much more work to do. The first 12 guidelines have been hopefully put in the bank, and we are going to be working over the next 2 years at the next set. And there are some very sensitive issues, and Peter will, I'm sure, mention some of those issues as we move forward. It's not going to be easy, but we have to work together. And now we have to, as this meeting is why we're here, we have to start to talk about these guidelines, because these are going to affect the way that nations do their business in space. As our lead-off speaker said, safe and responsible use of outer space is the key. And we need now to move forward, and I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased that we are discussing these in such an open forum with all the stakeholders. One of the challenges that we have in COPIUS is that COPIUS is made up of states. As again, I repeat, we have 83, 84 states. The commercial sector, the academic sector, are not members of COPIUS. How do we bring these extremely important parts of the community into the discussions? How do we listen to them? How do we ensure that we have their ideas incorporated into these guidelines as we move forward? And this is part, and the agenda of COPIUS as we move forward, and this is part of the high-level forum that, of course, that Simonetta just mentioned. So I will stop there, but just to say that it is over the next 2 years, as I am now the chair and take the chair for the next 2 years of the committee, I give you my commitment. This will be the highest priority, as far as I'm concerned, to bring these long-term sustainability guidelines to the General Assembly, to get them approved in 2018, and to move forward with the agenda to increase these the sustainability activities through Unispace Plus 50. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hopefully chatting with some of you for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Peter Martinez, the chair of the COPIUS Long-Term Sustainability Working Group, and he really had quite a job herding all the cats. So congratulations, Peter, and thank you so much for coming to speak on this.
Thank you, Victoria. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to be here this morning to participate in this special event co-organized by the State Department and the Secure World Foundation to discuss the very important topic of space sustainability. I would like to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation to participate in this panel and for giving me the opportunity to present the progress of the UN COPUOS Working Group on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. The international regulatory framework for outer space activities is predicated on the notion that states, as subjects of international law, bear international responsibility and liability for outer space activities conducted by entities under their jurisdiction and/or control. The number and diversity of space actors is increasing rapidly, and the space environment is becoming increasingly congested in Earth orbit, with increased possibilities of contingency situations arising in orbit that could endanger the safety of space operations to the detriment of a wide variety of space actors. The actions of a single actor in outer space could have serious consequences for many other space actors. Conversely, no single actor, or even a group of like-minded states, can adopt measures to mitigate entirely the risks posed by the congestion in the Earth's orbital environment. This is an intrinsically multilateral issue. In his remarks, David Kendall showed you how COPUOS is the appropriately mandated multilateral body to address such questions. At the same time, the non-governmental space sector is growing in size and importance, and any multilateral solution to the problems of space sustainability must take into account the experience, capabilities, and concerns of non-state actors. The private sector has a lot of experience in the conduct of space activities. It also has a vested interest in a safe, stable, and conflict-free space environment with clear rules for the orderly and predictable behavior of all space actors. COPUOS has been addressing aspects of the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, or LTS as we refer to it in the committee, for quite a number of years. But it is only in the past few years that it has taken a more holistic approach to this topic. And I would like to recognize this morning the presence among us of Gérard Brachet, a former chairman of COPUOS, who played a leading role in the setting in motion the process that led to the creation of this working group. Building on the previous efforts of Gérard, in 2010 the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space established a new working group to focus on the long-term sustainability of outer space activities. The objectives and desired outputs of the working group include identifying areas of concern for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and proposing measures in the form of a set of voluntary, non-binding guidelines that could enhance the safe and sustainable use of outer space for peaceful purposes and for the benefit of all countries. In 2011, COPUOS adopted the terms of reference and the work plan for this working group, which included a comprehensive list of pertinent topics for consideration by the working group. These topics were clustered into 4 broad thematic areas, and in order to expedite its work, the working group established expert groups to discuss the topics in these thematic areas in parallel. Expert Group A addressed sustainable space utilization supporting sustainable development on Earth and essentially explored the linkages between sustainable development on Earth and space sustainability. Expert Group B addressed space debris, space operations, and tools to support collaborative space situational awareness. And I'd like to recognize among us the presence today of Richard Benecke, one of the co-chairs of that expert group. Expert Group C addressed space weather issues and the effects of space weather on space systems. Expert Group D addressed the regulatory regimes and guidance for space actors in the space arena, and we're privileged to have among us one of the co-chairs of that group, Professor Sergio Marchisio, who will be speaking in a subsequent panel. The expert groups comprised scientific, technical, policy, and legal experts nominated by the member states, and I would like to take the opportunity to thank the member states for supporting the participation of the experts in these groups for quite a number of years. Most of the guidelines that we adopted in June this year were the ones that had reached a high level of maturity, particularly because of the inputs of the experts in the early discussions and the proposals of those guidelines. So thank you to all the member states who contributed their experts for quite a number of years. In contrast to the diplomatic negotiating format of COPUOS discussions, the expert groups were deliberative fora in which the experts exchanged their views and proposed draft guidelines for the consideration of the working group. Inputs from non-state actors were received through the relevant member states of COPUOS or through the permanent observers to the committee. These included intergovernmental organizations such as the ITU, other UN entities such as the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, professional bodies such as COSPAR or the IAA, international entities such as ISO and the IAF, and industry associations of several countries. In addition, in 2013, a long-term sustainability workshop was organized during the 56th session of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of COPUOS, where representatives of national private sector entities and industry associations were provided with an opportunity to share their experiences and perspectives on LTS with members of the working group. By mid-2013, the working group had before it a compilation of candidate guidelines proposed by the 4 expert groups. In 2014, the working group consolidated the candidate guidelines proposed by the expert groups to reduce duplication and overlaps, and during 2014 and 2015, several member states also proposed additional draft guidelines for consideration by the working group. As of the start of 2016, there were 29 draft guidelines under consideration, and it was clear that the various guidelines were at different levels of maturity, with some being largely agreed and therefore within the reach of consensus by COPUOS, while other draft guidelines still needed substantial further discussion to build consensus. Time does not permit me to give you a detailed blow-by-blow account of all the discussions in COPUOS. I see my co-chair, my co-panelist is smiling here because he knows the details, but suffice it to say that in June 2016, the working group reached consensus on 12 of the 29 guidelines, and it noted that this first set of guidelines was now ready for states and international intergovernmental organizations to consider implementing on a voluntary basis. The committee also agreed on a work plan for the period 2016 to 2018 to continue its discussions of the remaining guidelines and preambular text with a view to compiling a compendium of guidelines for long-term sustainability to be referred to the General Assembly in 2018, the same year as UNISPACE Plus 50. The first 12 agreed guidelines represent the low-hanging fruit of the LTS discussions, but they also mark a significant step forward in that they represent the tangible progress that has been made in COPUOS in addressing space sustainability. The first set of agreed guidelines creates a foundation for further consensus building in COPUOS. Time does not permit me to describe these 12 agreed guidelines in detail here, and indeed they're readily available on the website of the Office for Outer Space Affairs in the annex to the report of the 59th session of COPUOS. Broadly speaking, the agreed guidelines address the adoption and updating of national regulatory frameworks for space activities, the supervision of national space activities, and the rational and equitable utilization of radio frequency spectrum and orbital regions. There are a number of guidelines oriented toward the safety of space operations that address matters such as improving the accuracy of orbital data on space objects, the sharing of such information, as well as the sharing of information, models, and expertise on space weather phenomena and on established practices for the mitigation of adverse space weather effects on space systems. Lastly, some of the agreed guidelines address matters of awareness, capacity building, and research on ways to support space sustainability and to manage the space debris population in the long term. Of the remaining draft guidelines still currently under discussion, some are closer to consensus than others. These include guidelines on exchange of contact information of spacecraft operators, exchange of information on orbital events, conjunction assessments for objects in orbit, and pre-launch conjunction assessments. There are guidelines on proposed guidelines on enhancing registration practice, on conducting space activities solely for peaceful purposes, on ensuring the security and integrity of ground infrastructures used to support space activities, and also proposed guidelines on active debris removal and on destruction in very exceptional circumstances of space objects in orbit. Not surprisingly, the draft guidelines where we are still far from consensus are those that touch on more sensitive topics, such as the removal of space objects from orbit, issues of cybersecurity, technology safeguards, and intellectual property safeguards in the areas of international cooperation and information sharing. It is entirely possible that although the working group may not achieve consensus on some of the proposed guidelines within the current extended work plan, it may reach consensus on the need to continue discussions on those topics within COPUOS in future. Indeed, one may identify topics currently not under discussion, which could be addressed by COPUOS under the general context of LTS in future. Perhaps issues arising from on-orbit servicing, or the placement and operation of large-scale constellations in Earth orbit could be the subjects of such future discussions and possibly future guidelines, future proposals for guidelines. I would like to report that in the period since June, when these first 12 guidelines were agreed, we had a very successful intersessional meeting in Vienna in late September, and we're very hopeful that this has created fertile ground for making further progress in agreeing on additional guidelines in the coming sessions of COPUOS in 2017. I would like to end my statement with a few reflections on the way forward, both in terms of the process and the substance of the LTS discussions within COPUOS. From the process perspective, I would like to point out that as the LTS process has gathered momentum, so too has the number of states participating actively in the discussions. During the expert group stage of the discussions, it was mainly the countries with established space capabilities that contributed to the initial drafting of guideline proposals. But as the process entered the negotiation stage, more states started participating actively in the discussions. Currently, this stands at 45 member states. This is a very encouraging trend for a process that can only achieve result by consensus of the growing number of COPUOS member states, which currently stands at 83 and soon to be 84. Working by consensus is slow, difficult work, but in the absence of legally binding international instruments to promote space sustainability, the LTS guidelines provide a pragmatic way for the global space community to take urgent action now to preserve outer space for future generations. From a substantive perspective, the working group will need to ensure that the guidelines represent a balance of the interests of nations at different levels of development of their space capabilities. The barriers to space activity are being lowered, and many more actors are entering the space arena. It is in no one's interest for emerging space actors to repeat the lessons learned in the first 50 years of the space age on how to conduct safe and sustainable space activities. Therefore, the guidelines should be seen as a strong encouragement for states with considerable accumulated experience in space activities to share appropriate experience, established best practices, and relevant information with emerging space actors to the benefit of all users of outer space. This accounts for the strong thread on international cooperation, information sharing, and capacity building that runs through the guidelines. Of course, the guidelines will only be effective if they are implemented by the member states to the greatest extent practicable. Indeed, implementation of the guidelines will be the litmus test as to whether voluntary, non-binding instruments can be an effective means to promote space sustainability. In this regard, The implementation experiences of states will be useful to establish the effectiveness of the guidelines as well as to amend them if necessary. Here again, the implementation experiences of non-state actors will be a valuable source of information for the LTS process going forward. We will also need criteria for the consideration of proposals for new guidelines and for the amendment of existing guidelines in future. It is worth emphasizing that although the guidelines are voluntary and non-binding, this does not mean that they are non-legal, in the sense that states may implement the guidelines at national level in a way that has legal character for entities under their jurisdiction and/or control. The speakers before me have highlighted the linkages between the LTS discussions and the Unispace plus 50 thematic priorities, so I will not repeat what they have said. However, with regard to the future of LTS discussions in Corpus, the run-up period to Unispace plus 50 would be a good time to think about how we would like to structure the LTS discussions in Corpus in future. In the immediate post-2018 period, the emphasis in the discussions will probably shift from negotiation of new guidelines to implementation experiences, to the sharing of implementation experiences, and discussions on procedures for the revision of guidelines or the introduction of new proposals for guidelines in future. The point is that we should maybe think about LTS as being an activity under the main committee of COPUOS, rather than under the scientific and technical subcommittee, as is the case at present, as this would allow for improved coordination and dovetailing of relevant LTS-related activities under the agendas of the two subcommittees of COPUOS. The challenges of LTS are inherently multilateral challenges, and it is my genuine belief that in multilateral space diplomacy, the international community has an opportunity to work together to find ways not only to expand the access to the benefits of space to more nations, but also to ensure that the space environment is preserved and protected for use by future generations. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the perspectives of the other participants at this event. Thank you.
Okay, great. That gives us some time for Q&A. I'd like to use the power of the chair to start off the discussion. And actually, Peter, your presentation raised a question in my mind. Do you guys envision guidelines discussions to be a permanent part of the COPUOS or at least SDSC work? Yeah.
Thanks, Victoria. Well, I think this is something that we will have to discuss in the next few years as the focus, of course, is necessarily on wrapping up the discussion of the guidelines that are currently on the table. But as I said in my remarks, the implementation stage is going to be key. So we need to figure out a way in which the implementation phase of LTS will be discussed, and whether this is through an agenda item or some other mechanism is something that we still need to discuss and agree in COPUOS.
Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I think from my perspective that we do have to find a way to ensure that this activity is not stopped or is not slowed down through after 2018, which is the extent to which the committee has extended the working group on the long-term sustainability. I think that there is very good signs that states that are members of the committee understand the importance of continuing this work. As Simonetta mentioned, there are quite a few linkages between the thematic priorities that we are discussing now and the current primary issues that we're dealing with in the future. Space debris mitigation, and certainly remediation is one that comes to mind straight away, and that is part of where I think Unispace Plus 50 is moving through some of its priorities. Space weather is another one that Simonetta mentioned that is clearly something which we need to continue to work on and to strengthen the governance, I would say, global governance of this activity. So yes, I'm very hopeful that we have a good path forward to ensure that we will continue the important work and, as Peter mentioned, share now hopefully practices that where these guidelines are being implemented by many states, which I think is absolutely crucial to ensure that that dialogue there's a mechanism for that dialogue moving forward.
And then following up on that, everyone mentioned that COPUOS now has 83, soon to be 84 members. That's a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives. I'm wondering if you envision at any point the possibility of changing how COPUOS functions or the guidelines functions to be from a consensus-based organization to a majority vote organization.
I cannot reply on this. It's up to you.
Yeah.
I'm the executive. I cannot reply.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victoria. Well, I won't respond directly to the question you've just asked, but I will give you a perspective from the LTS viewpoint. So we are, of course, very mindful that as more states join the discussions, that there is a danger of reopening guidelines that have been agreed to by consensus in the past. So these guidelines that we agreed to in June, there was an understanding in the committee that those would not be touched again in the period before 2018. There may be, of course, at the end when we compile the compendium, we may need to harmonize some of the guidelines to address issues of terminology or whatever. But there's an understanding in the working group that we would not reopen those guidelines. So what do we do between now and 2018 as we move forward and hopefully reach agreement on a number of guidelines in each session of COPUOS? As chair of the working group, I would hope that we could be in a situation where, as we reach agreement on guidelines in this 2016 to 2018 period, we could agree to bank the guidelines and then not reopen them and focus our discussion on the remaining body of material. So that is the pragmatic way in which we are addressing the development of the guidelines in the context where there's a growing number of member states. Thank you.
Let me just say that as chair, having to reach consensus amongst 83 states with certainly different outlooks on the way that the world functions is certainly a challenge, but also a great benefit, because once you do reach that consensus, you have put off the table the issue that states can say, well, I never agreed to that, and continuing the debate. You have finished the debate. You have a signed document by 83 states who have all agreed to move forward in a certain way. Getting there is tricky, yes, but in the end, states in the committee understand that. And I think that where we have what we have achieved with the long-term sustainability is an excellent example of how consensus can be reached in some very, very sensitive areas. And so I think that personally, as I would not like to see the modus operandi of the committee change because of the advantages one receives, one gets at the end of the process.
I can keep asking questions, but maybe, are there any audience members with questions at this point? Raise your hands. All right, one in the back. Could you please wait for the mic and then identify yourself? I think Stephanie, yeah.
Thanks. Chris Johnson from Secure World Foundation. So you say that there's some draft guidelines which you've finalized, some which are closer to consensus, and some which are further away in reaching consensus. Can you kind of give an outlook on the challenges in finalizing those ones which are closer, the challenges which are further away, and then within the UN, what is the destination for those guidelines once they're finalized by COPUOS? their referral to General Assembly, and in what type of form within the UN are they finalized? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So, as I mentioned in my remarks, the guidelines where we're closer to achieving consensus are those dealing with, for example, the sharing of information on contacts of operators, orbital events, conjunction analyses. There are a number of open issues there, but I'm fairly cautiously optimistic that we will be able to reach agreement on those guidelines. Guidelines that where I think we may be a bit further from achieving consensus at this stage are the ones that are dealing with more sensitive issues such as cybersecurity or the removal of objects from orbit. There are questions around the legal status of unregistered objects and so on. We will continue in terms of the mode of discussion. We will continue to discuss all of these open guidelines in the upcoming sessions of the main committee and the scientific and technical subcommittee. We have also in recent years followed the practice of having intersessional meetings. As I mentioned, we had an intersessional meeting in Vienna in the last week of the penultimate week of September, which was characterized by a remarkable spirit of flexibility and cooperation on the part of all the member states present, and it was a very well-attended meeting. So I'm optimistic that we will continue to make progress on all of the guidelines, even the ones where we're further from consensus at this point. And we may not reach consensus on all of the elements, but I'm optimistic that we will reach consensus on many, if not most of them. And if for those where we don't, we may agree to continue those discussions in an ongoing LTS process of some sort. With regard to how the guidelines will be taken forward in the General Assembly, there is a general understanding in the working group that the guidelines, once the compendium of guidelines is compiled in 2018, that this will be referred to the General Assembly in some appropriate form. That form has to be decided by the working group and endorsed by the committee. That decision hasn't yet been taken, but I think it is the intent that these will be referred to the General Assembly in 2018.
No, I'll just add to that yesterday the report, the 2016 report of the of COPIOS to the General Assembly was approved by the Fourth Committee of the General Assembly. In that report, it notes the report includes an annex which has all the guidelines, those that have been tentatively approved and those that have that are still being worked upon. There is a note, though, in the resolution that says that the annex is not part of the formal approval process. So all states, all 193 states of the United Nations now have before them a document which shows the current status of the long-term sustainability activity, although, as noted, it is not part of the formal approval of the report for this year. The report does note that the process that Peter just mentioned, where we will be bringing forward to the General Assembly in 2018 a full compendium of agreed upon guidelines, is the plan. And so, again, the General Assembly is aware of the process, has approved the report without the annex, but is aware of the annex and the process.
Well, Simonette, actually, I have a question for you. Slightly shifting focus a little bit, but UNOSA has been in the news lately for having signed agreements with both Sierra Nevada Corporation and Digital Globe about cooperative efforts. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about those agreements and what UNOSA hopes to get from it and what the status is on that.
Yeah, with pleasure. For sure, as I mentioned in my statement, there is a need in the preparation of Unispace Plus 50 to look at the the broader space community, and also to look at new ways of fulfilling our mandate in a way. So under the umbrella of the Human Space Technology Initiative, which started in 2010, we've been signing, in particular, 3 agreements recently. One with JAXA for the KiboCube project, which is dealing mainly with development of CubeSats from principal investigators. Proposals from principal investigators from developing countries. And we made an announcement of opportunity last year together. We made the selection together, and we just selected the first CubeSat from the University of Kenya, which is going to deploy it from the Kibo module on the International Space Station next year. That's the first part. And it's already a first step in order to start doing capacity building in developing countries in a different way. So not only anymore capacity building, training, workshops, technical advisory missions, which are still very, very important, and we will continue to do that, but there's also another way of, helping developing countries in getting the benefits of space activities for their own development. The second agreement, which has been signed back in March, because the one with JAXA was last year, so it's already advanced in a certain way, and we just issued the second announcement of opportunity where we were in Guadalajara for the ISE. The second agreement, as I said, under the umbrella of HSTI, is an agreement that I signed with the Chinese Manned Space Agency, and is an agreement that I signed with the Chinese Manned Space Agency, and is an agreement in order to allow developing countries to send experiments in low Earth orbit through the Chinese space station. We are in the process of, hire someone to do this job, and we hope that the announcement of opportunity could be out second quarter next year, maximum beginning of the summer period next year. And then we recently signed the agreement with Sierra Nevada Corporation. There is a strong push in order to develop more and more collaborations with the private sector. In this specific case, Sierra Nevada is a very unique development undergoing, the Dream Chaser. And so the idea is to have by the 2021 the first UN space mission with Dream Chaser, where we would like to give open access to low Earth orbit to all countries. So with particular attention to developing countries again, but to all countries. What we are doing in this case is to look for sponsors and contributors in order to have not only the mission paid by say, project money, but also to support developing countries with this money. We have already some interesting dialogues ongoing. The announcement of opportunity, that's the target, should go out July next year if everything goes well. In any case, as I said, for the time being, the target launch date is end of 2021, and for a mission in orbit, so unmanned mission in orbit, 14 days. For what Digital Globe is concerned, the agreement was signed last year, and that's the first agreement that the Office for Outer Space Affairs has signed with a private company. You know well Digital Globe, they are a very well-known company in the world for providing high-resolution images, and which is quite important for our activities. So the main goal of this agreement is to develop a platform, mainly for the UN system, but more in general for all the potential users. The agreement we have that we have to provide requirements to them in order for them to develop the better platform, the best platform possible. And in order to prepare them for this development, we have been working together And up to now, we had what we call Discovery Days, already 3 Discovery Days. The first one was last year together with FAO, because clearly we are working with the other UN entities. So the first one, as I said, was in December last year in Rome with FAO. Then we had another one back in May, was in Geneva together with GEO, the Group of Earth Observation, and WMO. And the third one was just last week, mainly co-organized with UNDP. This is because what we want to do is really to explain how good is this idea we have been developing, and we want to collect all the user requirements and needs, mainly at this stage from the UN entities, and I have to tell you there were, as a minimum, 40 people attending in 20 different entities in New York. So I expect in the next coming months to be able to provide a requirement document to Digital Globe to develop this platform.
Thank you. Other questions? I can keep going. All right. Any from the audience?
Something like that.
Sorry.
Hello.
Thanks, Stephanie. My name is Audrey Schaefer, and I've had the privilege of being involved on the U.S. delegation for the last 6 years in negotiating the LTS guidelines. And in that time, the political dynamics have shifted quite a bit in a variety of ways, both in the committee as well as in the world. And that has affected the negotiation of the guidelines during that time. So I'm wondering, from your perspectives, as we look toward 2018, there's quite a bit of optimism, which I share, that we'll be able to complete negotiation of a second set and send the full compendium. And I'm wondering, from your different perspectives, having watched the process over the last 6 years, how you think the politics will shape up and what the signs are that we can look toward to be optimistic that we'll be able to have a great success in 2 years. Thank you.
Well, I will start off by not mentioning the US presidential election.
Thank you.
I'm always an optimist. I believe that that through the process, and you know very well as being a very key member of the team who has worked so diligently over the past 6 years under the remarkable leadership of Peter to get us to this stage, that often these negotiations and discussions rely on a certain amount of personalities. And I believe that this last 6 years has developed a certain relationship between the various actors that has developed basically confidence in the process. And I've been personally very, I would say, pleased at the way that the team works so clearly. Clearly, there are differences of opinion. These differences of opinion, as you point out, stem from geopolitics often, but in the end, the various states have given the responsibility to, I think, an excellent group of people who have got to know each other and got to know each other's way of working. And the UN, while imperfect, is, again, I just go back to a unique platform. If we didn't have the UN, UN COPIUS, we probably have to reinvent it, because where else do we get together in order to discuss issues that are critical to the security and safety of outer space activities for all actors? So a bit of a long answer to a simple question, and I am optimistic that although who knows what tomorrow will bring in the geopolitical arena, but I believe that the major actors are working diligently towards the same area, same direction, effectively. The one thing, let me be quite blunt with you, that worries me is the discussions not in COPIUS but on the Conference of Disarmament and the areas that in the security area that tends from time to time, I believe, to lean over towards the discussions in the peaceful arena of outer space affairs. I'm not. There's many more experts in the room than I that follow this much more closely. And I believe that although there continues to be a stalemate in that area, there is dialogue going on in these areas. Was mentioned, I think, this morning. Well, it was mentioned this morning about discussions between the US and China, for example, on aspects of security in space. These are very positive, and I think that I hope there is a willingness to continue those across the major powers in order to ensure that we have understanding and again, going back to the phrase that I used beginning of my intervention, transparency and confidence building, which is the key to where we need to be. Thank you.
Peter?
Thank you, David. Well, David has just said much of what I would have said, so I guess I'll be just very brief. Audrey, I think you and all the others in this room today who've worked so hard in the development of these guidelines, and I'd like to acknowledge too many to mention by name, but it's been a fantastic privilege to work with such professional colleagues in the past few years in developing these guidelines and continuing our discussions. What I've perceived as chair of the working group is a willingness by the member states, firstly an appreciation by the member states that we really cannot fail in this, in COPUS, that it has to succeed. We may differ on views in terms of the process going forward. There may be differences of opinion on certain substantive matters, but there is a lot of common ground where we can make progress, and it's my function as chair to try and identify this common ground where we can build consensus and to develop that as rapidly as possible so that we can then focus our discussions on the more difficult issues. I've seen a great willingness on the part of delegations to really listen to each other's perspectives and concerns, and also witnessed quite a lot of flexibility in terms of the discussions, certainly that took place in June and more recently in September. And to go back to a point that David mentioned about TCBMs, I think the very fact that we were able to reach agreement on these first 12 guidelines is in itself a TCBM. It shows that COPUS can reach consensus in discussions on very difficult issues, and it builds confidence for the process going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, more on the process, because all the other points have been touched. First of all, there is something that Chris was asking, and I would like to clarify that currently the Office for Outer Space Affairs is drafting a CRP, a conference room paper, which will be presented for the first time at the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee in the 2017 cycle, which means next year, at the beginning of next year, where we are going to present some ideas for discussion and final decision by member states on the organization of the activities for Unispace Plus 50, which will be a segment of the normal COPUS session in June 2018, and where we expect to have two documents, one out of the COPUS meeting session in June 2018, one being the usual report, which will then produce in a way the usual will be, let's say, in the information document for the omnibus resolution and the fourth committee and the General Assembly, and then the final approval by the General Assembly as usual. And then another document, which could be probably a resolution, again, to be discussed by member states starting from February next year, which will have a parallel life, which will deal mainly with Unispace plus 50. So 2018 is really an important milestone, and I would expect that all member states will look at June 2018 as a landing point overall, because from that point on, I'm sure they would like to look at the future with different perspectives. So I'm quite confident that we'll be with all the players working together toward the same goal. I'm quite sure that June 2018 will be a success overall.
We have time for probably one more question. Anyone? All right. No? Okay, I will ask the last question then. It seems like there's a real complementarity between the guidelines and treaty obligations that exist. I'm curious if you guys think that the international community will ever move back towards treaties for space issues, or are we permanently doing soft law sort of responses to this?
I think this is up to the somewhat the legal subcommittee and the legal committee to discuss. Maybe Professor Marchisio can discuss this later on in the day. My view is that everybody would like to see some more teeth in what we're doing. I think that there is a general consensus on that point. But nobody really sees a clear path on how to get there. And as Audrey pointed out, the geopolitics is going to be more and more. Well, it is all part of what we are working with every day in the committee, and the complexity of reaching a treaty now with the 83 states is, I wouldn't say overwhelming, but is close to being overwhelming from the perspective I have, unless there is a breakthrough. I think the breakthrough would only really come if the very top leaders of the major states decide that this is something which they really need to move forward on. And currently, I do not see through the G7 or the G20 exercise this being at that level. But I think that that's what it's going to take to make a breakthrough at a treaty level.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I agree with David. I think it's going to require leadership at that sort of level to move corpus back to a sort of treaty-making mode. We all know that there is not at the present time a great appetite for negotiating new legally binding treaties. So soft law instruments like guidelines and TCBMs are pragmatic measures that we can take. However, I would like to remark that TCBMs and guidelines, if they are observed or implemented to the greatest extent practicable by member states, could lead to established practice of states, and that might in the long run create fertile ground for the discussion of more legally binding norms. But for the time being, I think that the TCBMs and guidelines are the pragmatic route forward to address what are a set of very pressing issues of immediate importance. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say that, as been already mentioned, by the end of the year we will get New Zealand on board, so we will reach 84. And I can anticipate that I got already a couple of preliminary information that at least other two countries could ask for becoming members. At the very end, I believe this is the proof that we are fulfilling our mandate quite well, and the mandate is to bring the benefits of space to humankind, and the more countries we get on board, the more it seems to me that we are doing our job well altogether. So if we look at the positive side of the story, the more we are, the more we can go together. And be sure that what we do is not only important guidelines in the long-term sustainability, but overall, the entire broad spectrum of space activities is taken care, but the maximum number possible of countries and United Nations member states. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well put. All right. Did you?
Perhaps if I could just make one other remark to build on what I said. Even quite apart from talking about new legally binding instruments, perhaps we should first strive to build universal adherence to the existing body of space law that exists out there. And there are even member states of Corpus that haven't ratified some of the basic instruments. So I think that is another area that we should pursue within Corpus, is to encourage ratification of the existing space treaties. Thank you.
Good point. All right, with that, I think we're actually out of time. Please join me in thanking this panel for a fascinating discussion.